Conrad Valetti crushed the medical report in his fist and hurled it across the room. The paper hit the wall like a dead bird. "Say it again," he said, his voice so quiet it was more terrifying than a shout. Dr. Harmon didn't flinch, but his hands trembled. "You are infertile, Mr. Valetti. The poison destroyed the tissue permanently. There is no recovery." The most feared man in the city stood there, chest-heaving empire intact and completely devastatingly empty inside. If this story already has you gripped, hit that subscribe button. Right now, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and don't you dare leave before the ending. Trust me, you won't see it coming. Conrad Valetti had survived 4 assassination attempts, 2 federal investigations, and 1 war with the DeCaro family that left 17 men in the ground, none of them his. He had walked through fire literally and figuratively and come out the other side with more power, more money, and more enemies than any man had a right to carry. He had never once been afraid. Until today. He sat in Dr. Raymond Harmon's private clinic, a place so discreet it didn't exist on any map, owned quietly through 3 shell companies, and stared at the single sheet of paper on the desk between them. "I need you," Conrad said slowly, "to explain to me what I'm reading." Dr. Harmon folded his hands. He was a small man, precise and careful, the kind of doctor who served men like Conrad, not because he wanted to, but because he understood the cost of refusal. "The toxicology results confirm what we suspected when you came in 6 months ago with the chronic symptoms. The compound used, we believe it was introduced into your system somewhere between 4 and 6 years ago. It caused progressive and irreversible damage to your reproductive system." Conrad's jaw tightened. "Irreversible." "Yes. You're not giving me a percentage. You're not saying low chance. You're saying 0, Mr. Valetti." Dr. Harmon met his eyes with the steady calm of a man who had practiced this particular kind of courage. "Biological fatherhood is not possible for you. Not now, not with treatment, not ever." The silence in the room was the loudest thing Conrad had ever heard. He stood up slowly, the way he always did when the world was trying to knock him down, deliberately controlled, making sure every movement said, "I am not broken." He walked to the window. He looked out at the street below. Normal people? Cars? A woman walking a dog? A child on a bicycle? He thought about his father. Dominic Valetti had built this empire with his bare hands in one obsessive burning belief. Blood is the only thing that lasts. He had told Conrad that 1,000 times. Blood is the lock and the key. Blood is the wall and the gate. Without blood, everything you build is just a sandcastle waiting for the tide. Conrad turned back to the doctor. "Who knows about this report?" "Only me, and now you." "Keep it that way." Conrad straightened his jacket. "What you've told me today dies in this room. Permanently." Dr. Harmon nodded once, and the understanding between them was complete. Conrad walked out of the clinic, got into the back of his car, and told his driver Marco to take the long way home. He needed to think. The empire of Conrad Valetti was not simply a criminal organization. It was an ecosystem. Restaurants, real estate, import, businesses, construction, firms, private security companies, all of it threaded together by loyalty, fear, and the unspoken promise that the Valetti name would endure. His lieutenants didn't just work for him. They had built their lives around the assumption that one day Conrad's son would sit where Conrad sat and the machine would keep turning. Conrad had no son. He had no children at all by choice, he had always told himself. The life was too dangerous. The time wasn't right. He was 38 years old. There was time. Except now there wasn't. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Felix, his brother. He let it ring. Felix Valetti was 4 years younger, sharper in the social ways Conrad had never cared for, always dressed like he was about to be photographed. He smiled in a way that made people feel chosen. Conrad had always known his brother was hungry, not for food, not for money, but for the chair. The chair at the head of the table. The chair that Conrad occupied. He let Felix's call go to voicemail. When they pulled up to Serafina, his restaurant, the crown jewel of his legitimate holdings, a place where the city's powerful came to be seen, Conrad didn't go inside immediately. He sat in the car and watched the front entrance for a moment. He wasn't sure why. Then he saw her. Reese Calloway was carrying a tray of water glasses through the side entrance when she tripped on the lip of the doorway, not a fall, more of a stumble, graceful in its ugliness, and caught herself against the doorframe without spilling a single drop. She straightened up, adjusted the tray, and walked on like it hadn't happened. Conrad watched that tiny moment and felt something shift in his chest that he couldn't name. He had noticed Reese before. You didn't run a restaurant and not notice your staff, especially the ones who worked harder than they were paid to. She had been at Serafina for almost 2 years, 27 years old. Quiet, efficient, never complained even when the kitchen ran her ragged, even when the wealthy clientele treated her like furniture. He had read her personnel file 6 months ago, not for any particular reason. He read all his employees' files. It was habit. Reese Calloway. No family. A dead mother, a father who had left before she could remember his face. A mountain of debt medical bills, mostly from her mother's illness, that she was slowly methodically paying down on a waitress's salary. She rented a room from an elderly neighbor and sent money home to a younger cousin in another state. She worked every shift she was offered. She never called in sick. Conrad got out of the car. Inside Serafina, the dinner service was just beginning to heat up. Conrad moved through the restaurant with the natural authority of a man who owned not just the room, but the air inside it. Staff straightened unconsciously as he passed. His manager, a nervous Italian named Greg, appeared at his elbow. "Mr. Valetti, we weren't expecting you tonight." "I'm not here." Conrad said it pleasantly, which everyone understood to mean, "Pretend I'm not here." He sat at his private table in the corner, the one that was always held, always clean, always ready, and ordered nothing, which also meant, "Bring me everything quietly and don't bother me." He watched the floor. He watched Reese. She moved through the service the way some people move through crowds, not pushing, not fighting, just finding the spaces. She remembered orders without a pad half the time. When a table of 4 businessmen got rude with her, the kind of rude that pretended to be joking, she handled it with a smile so precise it could cut glass. She didn't flinch. She didn't simper. She gave them exactly what they needed and moved on. Conrad recognized something in that, the art of survival without surrender. He was still watching when his phone buzzed again. Not Felix this time. Damian Cruz, his chess lieutenant, the man who ran the street-level operations of the Valetti organization. If Damian was calling, it wasn't to chat. Conrad stepped outside. "Talk," he said. "Word is moving," Damian said without preamble. "The DeCaro brothers are meeting tomorrow. Private location, no announcement. Our inside says it's about succession." Conrad was still. They heard something. "They heard something, boss. I don't know what. But you know how they work. They don't meet about succession unless they see an opening." Yeah, the DeCaro family had been rivals since Conrad's father was alive. They had tried twice to take the territory, failed twice, and retreated into a cold, watchful patience. They were predators who understood the value of waiting. If they were meeting about succession, they had heard about his infertility, which meant the leak had already started, which meant Dr. Harmon's quiet clinic was not as quiet as Conrad believed. "Find the source," Conrad said, quietly, and Damian. "Yeah, boss. Don't move on anything yet. I need to think." He hung up and stood alone outside Serafina, the city humming around him, and for the first time in years, he felt the specific cold weight of being genuinely cornered. Back inside, he made a decision. It wasn't impulsive. Conrad Valetti did not make impulsive decisions. It was the kind of decision that crystallizes in the mind when the situation strips away every comfortable option and leaves only the raw functional truth. He needed an heir, not a biological one. That door was closed forever per Dr. Harmon. But the appearance of one, the possibility of one, was its own kind of weapon in a world built on perception. And what he needed even more immediately was a visible, credible partnership. A woman at his side who looked like a future, who looked like continuity, who would make the DeCaro brothers pause before they moved. He needed a wife, not a real one, not in the way people meant when they said that word. He needed a strategic one, someone smart enough to understand this arrangement, brave enough to step into it, and critically someone who had enough of their own reasons to need him back. He looked across the restaurant floor. Reese was refilling a water glass, her back straight, her expression neutral and professional. A woman carrying a world on her shoulders that no one in the room could see. He summoned Greg. "The woman Calloway, send her to my table when service slows." Greg blinked. "Sir." "Not like that," Conrad's voice carried the particular flat note that stopped conversations. "Tell her I want a word. Professional." Reese came to his table 40 minutes later at the tail end of the dinner rush. She stood across from him, not nervous, which surprised him, or maybe she was nervous and just refused to show it, which impressed him more. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Valetti?" "Sit down, Miss Calloway." She sat, slowly, carefully, like a person who had learned that comfort could be a trap. "You've been here 2 years," he said. "Almost, yes. You've never been late. You've never filed a complaint. You've covered 6 shifts this month that weren't yours." She watched him steadily. "Is there a problem with my work?" "No, the opposite." He leaned forward slightly. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to hear it completely before you react. Can you do that?" Something moved through her eyes. Caution, calculation. The particular intelligence of someone who has had to read rooms and people her whole life to stay safe. "I can do that," she said, Conrad told her. "Not everything. Not the infertility, not the doctor, not the full scope of the threat closing in on him." He told her enough. He told her about the need for a partner. He told her about the arrangement, the legal marriage, the residence, the financial terms that would eliminate her debt entirely and leave her with enough money to build a real life afterward. He told her what would be expected presence, discretion, the performance of a life together in front of the right people. He told her what would not be expected. When he finished, the restaurant had mostly emptied around them. Reese sat with her hands flat on the table and her eyes somewhere past his shoulder, thinking. "You're not asking me," she said finally. "You're offering a contract." "Yes. And if I say no, you walk back to your section, finish your shift, go home, and we never have this conversation." She looked at him directly then, and he saw it, the thing he'd recognized from outside, the refusal to be small. "My debt," she said, "all of it, paid in full, the day you sign, and I keep my own room, my own space. You'll have an entire wing of the house. I want it in writing, a real contract, with a real lawyer, my lawyer, not yours." Conrad felt for the first time since that morning something that wasn't dread. Done. Reese was quiet for one more long moment. Then she nodded once clean, definitive. "All right, Mr. Valetti," she said. "You have yourself a deal." She stood up, smoothed her apron, and walked back to clear her tables. Conrad watched her go and thought she has no idea what she's walking into. But then again, neither did he. 3 days later, the contract was signed. 5 days after that, Reese Calloway moved into the Valetti estate with 2 duffel bags and a look on her face that dared anyone to pity her. The staff watched her arrival with the calculated silence of people who understood that how they responded to this moment would be noticed and remembered. Marco Conrad's driver and oldest soldier met her at the door with a nod that held genuine respect. The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldrin, gave her a tour with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had seen plenty and said nothing. Reese walked through the mansion with her chin level and her eyes taking in everything. She did not look like a woman overwhelmed. She looked like a woman assessing. That evening, as Conrad found her in the kitchen, not being served, but making herself a cup of tea, comfortable in the space like she had decided it was hers and moved on. "You could have asked the staff," he said from the doorway. "I know how to make my own tea," she said without turning around. "I prefer it." He almost smiled. Almost. "Tomorrow we have dinner with my brother," he said. "Felix." She turned then. "Is he the kind of problem I should know about before I meet him?" Conrad was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "He's the kind of problem," he said carefully, "that smiles while he's measuring you." Reese nodded slowly, processing that. "Got it." She picked up her tea and walked past him toward the hallway. "Reese," she stopped. "Be careful what you say to him. Not because you'll say the wrong thing." He paused. "Because you might say exactly the right thing and he'll use it." She looked at him over her shoulder with those steady, unafraid eyes. "Mr. Valetti," she said quietly, "I've been careful my entire life. You don't need to remind me." She walked away. And Conrad stood alone in his own kitchen, in his empire, with his arrangement and his secret and his 0% chance of a future, and had absolutely no idea that in less than 8 weeks, Reese Calloway was going to turn his entire world upside down with 3 words. "I am pregnant." Felix Valetti arrived exactly 7 minutes late to his own brother's dinner, not because he had a reason to be late, but because he had learned long ago that the person who arrives last controls the temperature of the room. Conrad was already seated at the head of the dining table when Felix walked in, jacket open, smile wide, carrying a bottle of wine like it was a gift and not a prop. Reese was seated to Conrad's right. Felix stopped walking for exactly 1/2 second when he saw her. A lesser observer would have missed it. Conrad did not miss it. "Brother," Felix said, his voice warm, his eyes already busy, "and this must be the woman who's had the whole city talking." He crossed to Reese and extended his hand. She took it. Firm grip, level eyes. "Reese Calloway," she said. "It's nice to meet you." "Oh, the pleasure is entirely mine." Felix sat across from her with the ease of a man who believed every room was already his. "Conrad tells me almost nothing, so I've had to rely on what other people say, which I have to be honest is quite a lot." "What are people saying?" Reese asked. It wasn't defensive, it was direct, the question of someone who actually wanted the information. Felix blinked once. He hadn't expected that. "They say you came from nowhere, a waitress, smart, quiet." He tilted his head. "They say Conrad moves differently since you arrived." "I've been here less than 2 weeks," Reese said. "Yes," Felix smiled. "That's what's interesting." Conrad picked up his wine glass. "Felix, enough. I'm just talking, Conrad." But Felix leaned back, recalibrating. He looked at his brother with eyes that measured everything and gave nothing back. "I'm just trying to get to know the woman you married in a private ceremony with no family present. Forgive me for being curious." The word married dropped onto the table like a stone into still water. Nobody flinched, but the ripples moved through all three of them differently. "We'll have a formal event when the time is right," Conrad said. "Of course," Felix turned back to Reese. "So tell me, what do you make of all this, the house, the life, my brother?" He gestured vaguely at everything. "It's a lot to absorb." Reese looked at him steadily. "I'm not easily overwhelmed." "No," Felix said, and something in his tone changed, subtle, like a key turning in a lock. "I don't imagine you are." Dinner arrived. The three of them ate, and the conversation moved, the way conversations move when everyone at the table is performing something different. Felix performing ease, Conrad performing control, Reese performing calm. And underneath all three performances, the real conversation hummed in silences and pauses, and the particular weight of things not said. Halfway through the main course, Felix set down his fork. "Can I ask you something personal, Reese?" "You can ask," she said. "Do you love my brother?" The table went still. Even the staff near the doorway seemed to stop breathing. Reese looked at Felix without blinking. Then she looked at Conrad just for a moment, just long enough, and then back at Felix. "I think," she said carefully, "that love is something that earns its name over time, not something you announce." "Well, so." Felix stared at her. Then he laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him. "Well," he said, sitting back. "Conrad, she's something." Conrad said nothing. But his hand, which had been resting on the table, moved slightly closer to Reese's. Neither of them acknowledged it. Felix saw it, and his smile almost imperceptibly shifted. After dinner, Conrad walked Felix to the door while Reese excused herself. The two brothers stood alone in the entry hall, and the warmth that Felix had performed all evening evaporated like morning frost. "She's smart," Felix said quietly. "Yes. Smart enough to know what this arrangement is." Conrad looked at him. "This arrangement is a marriage. My marriage." Felix's jaw tightened. "Conrad, we've known each other our entire lives. Don't insult me." "I'm not insulting you, I'm informing you. There are people who are asking questions." Felix stepped closer, dropping his voice lower. "People inside the organization. They're saying, and I am telling you this as your brother, not as anyone else, they're saying that you brought in a woman from nowhere because something is wrong, because you need a cover." Conrad felt the cold move through him, but let none of it touch his face. "People say a lot of things." "They say you're dying," Felix said. And there it was, the real dinner conversation, the one they'd been building toward since Felix walked in 7 minutes late. "Are you where I am? Do I look like I'm dying?" "You look exactly the same as you always do, which tells me nothing." Felix paused. "If there is something wrong medically, physically, anything I need to know, the organization needs to know, not because we want to move against you, because we need to prepare." "Prepare," Conrad repeated flatly, "for succession." The word hung between them. Conrad took one step toward his brother. "Let me be very clear with you, Felix. There is nothing to prepare for. I am not dying. My wife is not a cover. And if I hear that word succession being used in any context that involves me still breathing, I will be very unhappy. And you know what happens when I'm unhappy. Felix held his ground, but his eyes just for a moment flickered. I'm trying to help you, Felix said. I know, Conrad said. And the terrible thing was part of him believed it. Part of him also knew that Felix's version of help and Conrad's version of help had never once been the same thing. Good night, Felix. He closed the door. He stood alone in the hall for a on. Then he turned and found Reese standing at the top of the stairs looking down at him. She had heard. He could see it in her face, not shock, not fear, but the careful, alert expression of someone filing information away. He thinks you're hiding something, she said. He's right. And he's going to keep pulling at it until he finds out what. Conrad looked up at her. Yes. Reese was quiet for a moment. What do you need me to do? He had not expected that question, not the generosity of it, not the steadiness. Nothing yet, he said. Just be here. She nodded once and went back to her room. Conrad stood at the bottom of his own stairs in his own house and understood clearly and uncomfortably that the most dangerous person in his life right now was not his enemies on the outside. It was his brother on the inside. 4 days later, Damien called again. Conrad took the call and his office door closed, standing at the window the way he always did when the news was bad. We found the source, Damien said. Who? A pause that said everything. It came from inside the clinic. An assistant, young guy, been there 8 months. He sold the information to an intermediary. We don't have the full chain yet, but the money trail points toward the DeCaro family. Conrad closed his eyes for 1 second. The assistant. We're handling it. Quietly. Always. Conrad opened his eyes. And the DeCaros, they've made 3 calls to Felix in the last week. The cold that moved through Conrad then was different from the cold he'd felt at the doctor's office. That had been the cold of loss. This was the cold of war. You're sure, Conrad said. 3 calls, 2 from Victor DeCaro directly. Victor DeCaro, the eldest brother here, the patient one. The one who had waited 17 years to make a move, who had sat across negotiating tables from Conrad with a smile that meant absolutely nothing and eyes that never stopped calculating. Victor DeCaro calling Felix directly meant one thing: he believed Felix could be turned, which meant either Victor DeCaro had badly misjudged Felix's loyalty or he hadn't. Don't approach Felix, Conrad said. Don't surveil him overtly. Just watch the calls. I want to know if he answers. He answered all 3, boss. Conrad set the phone down. He sat in his office for 17 minutes without moving. 17 minutes was a long time for a man like Conrad Valetti, who processed information quickly and moved faster. But this was not information he could process quickly. This was the particular nauseating pain of watching your brother potentially choose the wrong side while understanding completely why it might be happening. Felix had spent 34 years in Conrad's shadow. He had talent and charm and genuine intelligence, and all of it had been subordinate to Conrad's authority for as long as either of them could remember. Conrad had never thought about how that felt. He had never thought about it because he had never needed to. He was thinking about it now. When he came out of his office, Reese was in the sitting room with a book, her legs tucked under her, completely absorbed. She looked up when he came in, and whatever she saw in his face made her close the book. Something happened, she said. It wasn't a question. My brother, Conrad said, and then stopped because the next words were harder than he expected them to be. My brother may be working against me. Reese was very still. Maybe, or is? I don't know yet. What's your gut say? He looked at her. People did not ask Conrad Valetti what his gut said. They asked him for decisions, for orders, for verdicts. They did not ask him about the interior weather of his instincts. My gut says he's not sure yet, Conrad said slowly. He's listening, he's measuring, he hasn't decided. Then you still have time. Not much. Reese uncurled from the chair and stood up. What would change his mind? What does Felix actually want? Conrad was quiet for a long moment. To matter, he said finally. He wants to matter in his own right. Not as my brother, as himself. Reese absorbed that. Then give him something real to do, something that's his, not because you need him to do it, because you trust him with it. Conrad stared at her. It won't guarantee anything, she added, reading his expression, but it's harder to betray someone who genuinely trusted you. Felix is calculating, not evil. There's a difference. How do you know that? She looked at him with those level, unimpressed eyes. Because evil doesn't bother performing charm for 2 hours at a dinner table. Evil just takes what it wants. Felix is performing, which means he still cares what you think of him. Conrad said nothing for a long moment. Where did you learn to read people like that? He asked. Something moved through her expression. Quick private, a door opening and closing in under a second. Hard life, she said simply. Cheap tuition. She picked up her book and walked toward the hallway. Reese, she stopped. Thank you. She glanced back onto him, and the look on her face was not warmth, not exactly, but it was something real, something that had not been performed or calculated. Don't thank me yet, she said. I haven't done anything. She walked away, and Conrad sat down in the chair she had just left, still warm from her, and thought about the fact that the most useful person in his empire right now was a woman he'd hired 3 weeks ago from the floor of a restaurant. The next morning, Conrad called Felix. Felix answered on the second ring, which told Conrad he'd been expecting the call. I want to give you something, Conrad said without preamble. Silence. Then what kind of something? The port operations, the whole northern logistics chain. I want you to run it, not report to someone who runs it. Run it. Your decisions, your relationships, your budget. The silence that followed was longer. Conrad, Felix said slowly. Why? Because you're capable of it, and I've been using you wrong. A pause. And because I trust you. The words cost him something real. He meant them, and they cost him. Felix was quiet for so long that Conrad thought the line had dropped. Then, I'll need a week to review the current structure before I agree. Take 2. Another pause. Are you all right? I'm fine. You don't give things away when you're fine. I'm not giving it away. I'm deploying you correctly. Conrad kept his voice even. There's a difference. Felix exhaled slowly. All right, he said. All right, I'll look at it. They hung up. Conrad didn't know if it would work. He didn't know if Felix had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. He didn't know if Victor Decoreux had already said the exact right thing to the exact right part of Felix's ambition. But Reese was right about one thing. It was harder to betray someone who had genuinely trusted you. He was betting on harder because it was all he had. That same afternoon, Reese came to him. She knocked on his office door. She always knocked, never walked in a small formality that he had come to notice and respect. And when he said, come in, she entered with the careful posture of someone carrying news that she wasn't sure how to put down. I need to tell you something, she said. He looked at her. Her face was composed, but there was something underneath it, something tightly held, something enormous, being kept carefully in a manageable shape. Sit down, he said. I'd rather stand. He waited. Reese pressed her lips together once. She looked at the window, then she looked back at him with those direct, unflinching eyes. I went to the doctor this morning, she said. I've been feeling off, tired, dizzy sometimes. I thought it was stress, the move, everything. I thought. She stopped, drew a breath. Conrad. He heard the way she said his name. Not Mr. Valetti, which was what she always called him. His name. Which meant whatever came next was not a professional conversation. I'm pregnant. The words hit him like a physical thing. He didn't move. He didn't speak. The room tilted slightly on its axis and righted itself, and he sat there, while the entire architecture of his reality rearranged itself around 2 words. That's not possible, he said. It wasn't disbelief directed at her. It was the medical fact that had been delivered to him by a man in a clinic 4 weeks ago, stated as absolute and permanent truth. 0. No chance. Irreversible. I know what the contract says, Reese said quietly. I know what the arrangement is. I know this is not what either of us planned. She paused. But I took 3 tests this morning, and I saw a doctor. She looked at him steadily. I am pregnant, Conrad. He stood up slowly from his desk. He walked to the center of the room. He stopped. He said nothing for a very long time, and Reese let him have the silence, which was either the bravest or the most intuitive thing anyone had done for him in years. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Not the voice he used to run an empire, not the voice he used to end conversations and settle arguments. Something older, something rawer. "Are you sure?" he said. "Yes. The doctor is certain." 6 weeks, she said. "He's certain." Conrad turned and looked at her. Really looked at her the way he hadn't allowed himself to look at her since the night she sat across from him at that restaurant table and agreed to turn her life inside out for a contract and a clean debt. "Reese," he said. "I know," she said softly. "I know." He crossed the room in 4 steps, and for a moment they stood close to each other, closer than the arrangement permitted, closer than the contract specified. And the thing between them was not romance, not yet, maybe not ever, but it was real. And in Conrad Valletti's life, real things were rarer than power. His phone rang. He ignored it. It rang again. He looked at the screen. "Damien," he answered. "Boss," Damien said, and his voice had the tight, clipped quality of genuine emergency. "Victor DeCaro just held a press conference. He's going public with an accusation. He's saying you're unfit to lead, medically unfit." A beat. He's naming a doctor. He's naming a clinic. Conrad's eyes went to Reese. She was watching him, reading his face, and he watched her watch him absorb the blow. The public explosion of the secret he had worked so hard to contain, and saw her eyes sharpen into something clear and deliberate. "He doesn't know yet," she said quietly. Just to Conrad. Just for him. He looked at her. "Victor DeCaro doesn't know about me," she said. "About this." Her hand moved barely toward herself. He made his move before he had all the information. Conrad held the phone to his ear. Damien was still talking. Conrad wasn't listening. Because Reese was right. Victor DeCaro had just played his hand a week too early. And in Conrad Valletti's world, a man who moved too early had already told you exactly where he was standing, which meant Conrad knew exactly where to hit back. He raised the phone back to his ear. "Damien," he said, and his voice was the Empire voice, again clean and cold and completely controlled. "Call a meeting, everyone, tonight." A pause. "And get me my lawyer." He ended the call. He looked at Reese. She looked back at him. "Whatever happens next," he said quietly, "this changes everything." "I know," she said. "Are you afraid?" She thought about it genuinely, thought about it, which he appreciated more than a quick, brave answer. "Yes," she said honestly. "But I've been afraid before. It didn't stop me." Conrad nodded slowly, and in the silence between them, with the Empire rattling on the outside and the impossible truth hanging in the air between them, something shifted, not dramatically, not with music or light, but the way foundations shift, deep, structural, permanent. Reese Calloway, the waitress who had walked into a contract, was carrying Conrad Valletti's child, and the man who had been told he had no future had just discovered that his future had been happening without his permission. The meeting that night was not the kind Conrad held in boardrooms with coffee and agendas. It was the kind held in a basement with no windows, and men who understood that what was said in that room never left it. 12 men, his top lieutenants, his legal team, Damien at his right hand. They sat around its long table and they looked at Conrad the way men look at a commander when the enemy has broken through the wall, not with panic, but with the tightly wound attention of soldiers waiting for orders. Conrad stood at the head of the table and let the silence do its work for exactly 10 seconds. Then he said, "Victor DeCaro made a public accusation this afternoon claiming I am medically unfit to lead." He cited a source inside a private clinic. He paused. "The source has been handled. The question now is how we respond." One of his lawyers, a sharp-faced man named Peretti, leaned forward. "Denial is the obvious move. We release a statement." "Denial is weak," Conrad said flatly. "Denial is what a man does when he's cornered." "I am not cornered." "Then what are we doing?" Damien asked. Conrad looked around the table. These men knew parts of the truth. None of them knew all of it. That was how Conrad had always operated information as architecture distributed. Carefully, no single person holding enough to build a complete picture without him. "We go on offense," Conrad said. "Victor moved publicly because he believes the story is already out and unstoppable. He's wrong. The story he thinks he's telling is already outdated." He let that sit for a moment. "Within 48 hours, I want a full medical statement from a panel of 3 independent physicians confirming my health. I want our media contacts running counter-narratives by morning. And I want everything we have on Victor DeCaro's last 6 months of business activity on my desk by sunrise. You think he's exposed somewhere? Peretti asked. Every man who moves in a hurry leaves something uncovered, Conrad said. Find it. The meeting broke. Men dispersed. Damien lingered until the room was empty, and when it was, he looked at Conrad with the particular directness of a man who had known him long enough to say the thing others wouldn't. Is it true? Damien said. What DeCaro said? Conrad held his gaze. What I told you in that room is what's true. We go on offense. Damien studied him for a long moment. He nodded slowly, not fully satisfied, but loyal enough to accept the boundary. All right, boss. And Damien, Conrad stopped him at the door. The only thing that matters to the outside world right now is that Conrad Valetti is standing breathing and in complete control. Nothing else. Damien looked back at him. And are you? Conrad answered without hesitation. Yes, it was the truest lie he had ever told. He found Reese awake when he came upstairs. She was sitting at the small desk in her room. The door was open, which was new. She had kept it closed the first 2 weeks with a glass of water, and that expression she wore when she was working through something too large to put down. He stopped in the doorway. You should sleep. You should too. She looked at him. How did the meeting go? We have a plan. That's not an answer. He almost smiled. We have a good plan. She turned fully toward him. Conrad, the accusation DeCaro made, even if you discredit it, even if you bury the source, some people already heard it. The doubt is already planted. I know. So the medical statement that helps with the public. But what about inside the organization? The men who are already wondering. He looked at her carefully. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, she said slowly, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood the weight of them, that a pregnancy announcement changes the entire narrative. Publicly. Completely. She held his eyes. Victor DeCaro accused you of being unable to lead. Nothing says able like a man building a future. The room was very quiet. Conrad stepped inside, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, looking at her in the way he'd started to look at her, not like a manager examining an asset, but like a man encountering something genuinely surprising. You're talking about using the pregnancy, he said. I'm talking about using the truth, she corrected, and which happens to also be strategically useful. That's not manipulation, that's just timing. He was quiet for a moment. We don't know yet how this happened, medically. No, she agreed, but it did happen, and it's real. She touched her own hand absently, a small private gesture. Whatever the doctor said before it happened anyway. Miracles don't win wars, Conrad said. No, but they change what people are willing to fight for. She met his eyes, including you. He had no answer for that, not a clean one. Get some sleep, he said finally. Tomorrow is going to be hard. Conrad, she stopped him just as he moved to leave. Whatever you decide about the announcement, make sure it's what you actually want, not just what wins. He stood in the doorway of her room in his house, with his impossible situation and his impossible news, and he looked at the woman his life had backed him into a corner with, and thought, I don't know anymore where strategy ends and wanting begins. He didn't say that. Good night, Reese, he said. Good night, she said. By the next morning, 3 things happened in rapid succession. The first, Peretti's team found what they were looking for in Victor DeCaro's business activity, a series of real estate transactions run through a subsidiary company that had accepted money from a federal contractor currently under criminal investigation. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a lit match held very close to one. The second, Felix called. Conrad answered on the first ring because when your brother calls at 7 in the morning after a night like that one, you answer. I heard about DeCaro, Felix said. He sounded tense, genuine. Conrad, I need you to know I had nothing to do with that. I didn't say you did. You were thinking it. Conrad was quiet. I have been talking to Victor, Felix said, and the confession came out like something that had been pressing against the inside of his chest. He approached me. He told me, a pause. He told me things about your condition that sounded convincing. And I listened. I'm not going to lie to you about that. I listened. But, Conrad said, but I didn't give him anything. And when he went public yesterday, I understood what he was doing. He wasn't asking for my help. He was using me as a signal showing you that he'd gotten close enough to approach your own brother. Felix's voice hardened. I don't want to be anyone's signal, Conrad, especially not against you. Conrad sat with that for a moment. The anger was there. It had been there since Damien told him about the calls, but underneath the anger was something more complicated. The thing Reese had named at the dinner table, Felix wanting to matter. The port operations, Conrad said. I meant what I said. I know. A pause. I'm going to take it, but not because you're giving it to me as a peace offering, because I'm capable of running it, and we both know it, and it's time. Agreed, Conrad said. Silence. The particular silence of two brothers who have come very close to something irreparable and pulled back at the last moment. Is there something wrong with you? Felix asked quietly. Medically, the real answer. Conrad closed his eyes for 1 second, then opened it on them. There was. The situation has changed. Another long pause. Changed how, Bosh? Kim. Reese is pregnant. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. When Felix spoke again, his voice had shifted into something Conrad hadn't heard from him in years. Something unguarded. Conrad, are you serious? Yes. But the doctors... I know what the doctors said. Conrad paused. Sometimes the doctors are wrong. Felix exhaled slowly, and then he said quietly and without performance, Congratulations, brother. Conrad felt the word land somewhere deep. Thank you, he said. The third thing that happened that morning was the one Conrad hadn't planned for. Reese's doctor called her with the results of the additional blood work from the previous day's visit. She took the call privately in her room. When she came to find Conrad 40 minutes later, she was carrying that carefully controlled expression again, the enormous thing held in a manageable shape. He was in his office. He looked up when she came in and knew immediately. What is it? She closed the door. She sat down across from his desk, not the way she had sat across from him in the restaurant, cautious and measuring, but the way a person sits when they are about to hand you something heavy and need to be close enough to steady you if necessary. The doctor ran the full panel, she said, standard for early pregnancy. She folded her hands in her lap. Conrad, there's something you need to know about the pregnancy. He waited. It's twins, she said. The world stopped for the second time in 24 hours. Not one impossible miracle. 2, he stared at her. She looked back at him with those steady, clear eyes that had somehow become the most reliable thing in his life in the span of 3 weeks. Twins, he said. 2 heartbeats, she confirmed, both strong. He leaned forward and put both hands flat on the desk and just breathed for a moment. Not with distress, or not only with distress, but with the particular overwhelm of a man whose entire nervous system is trying to process the rearrangement of everything he understood about his future. This isn't, he started, stopped, started again. Reese, I was told categorically. I know what you were told, she said gently. I know, but here we are. He stood up. He walked to the window. He turned back. Are you all right, Una, he asked. Physically. Are you all right? The doctor says everything looks healthy. For now, yes. For now. It's early, she said honestly. A lot can happen in the first trimester. He wants to see me weekly. Conrad nodded. His mind was moving, faster, security logistics, medical staff, the announcement, the organization, Felix de Caroam, all of it reshuffling around this new information like a deck of cards being cut. I'll have a private medical team assembled, he said. The best obstetricians in the country. Weekly visits here, not at a clinic. Conrad, Abraham, I know it's a lot, he said, but you are carrying, he stopped. The sentence sat unfinished between them because the weight of what she was carrying was too large for a clean sentence. He crossed the room and stood in front of her. I need you to be safe. Both of you. All. He stopped again. All 3 of you. Something in Reese's expression shifted, then a crack in the controlled composure just for a moment. Not weakness. The opposite. The look of a person who has been strong and alone for so long that genuine care from another person produces an almost involuntary reaction. She pressed her lips together, looked down for a second, looked back up. I'm not used to being someone people protect, she said. It was the most honest thing she had ever said to him. He didn't touch her. It wasn't the moment for it, but he held her gaze and said with a quietness that had nothing strategic in it, "Get used to it." By noon, Peretti had drafted the counteroffensive statement. By 2 in the afternoon, the 3 independent physicians had been briefed and were preparing their assessments. By 4, Conrad's media contacts were running stories that quietly and methodically began dismantling the DeCaro narrative. Not aggressively, not in a way that looked defensive, but with the steady factual drip of a faucet that eventually fills a room. Victor DeCaro issued a secondary statement, doubling down on his accusation. Conrad read it, put it down, and said to Peretti, "Release the real estate information tonight." Peretti raised an eyebrow. "All of it. Enough to make the right people start asking questions. Not enough to look like we're attacking. Enough to look like we're correcting the record." Peretti nodded and went to work. At 6 in the evening, Conrad's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. Something made him. "Mr. Valetti." The voice on the other end was older, measured. "This is Raymond Harmon, the doctor." Conrad's grip on the phone tightened. "Doctor, I thought I made my position clear about discretion." "You did, and I have maintained it completely." A pause. "The information that reached the DeCaro family did not come from me. I need you to understand that." "I know where it came from," Conrad said. "The assistant." "Yes," a breath. "But that is not why I'm calling." Another pause, longer, the kind that precedes something the speaker has been rehearsing. "Mr. Valetti, I've been reviewing my original findings. I've been reviewing them since your situation was leaked because I wanted to ensure my data was airtight before it became the ammunition." A pause that felt like a door opening slowly. "I found an error." The silence that followed was total. "What kind of error?" Conrad said. Not a question, a demand. "The original toxicology identified the compound correctly," Dr. Harmon said carefully. "But my assessment of the extent of the damage was based on data from a test that I now believe was contaminated in the laboratory. The extent and end of the damage was overstated, Mr. Valetti. Significantly overstated." Conrad sat down. "Are you telling me," he said slowly, "that your original diagnosis was wrong?" "I am telling you that it was incomplete, that the degree of damage was less severe than I reported." A long, careful pause. "Which means that the probability I assigned the 0 I gave you was not accurate." The word 0 had lived in Conrad's chest like a stone for 4 weeks. He felt it now, that stone, and felt something underneath it beginning impossibly to shift. "Why are you telling me this now?" Conrad asked. "Because you deserve the truth," the doctor said quietly. "And because I believe, given what I now understand about your situation, that the truth is relevant." After he hung up, Conrad sat in his office for a long time. The doctor's original verdict had broken something in him, something he hadn't even fully acknowledged breaking. Because men like Conrad Valetti do not sit with their breaks, they move through them. But it had broken. The certainty of a closed door. The weight of a no that could never become a yes. And now Reese was upstairs carrying 2 children he had been told could not exist. And the doctor who had told him that was calling to say he had been wrong. Conrad thought about his father, about blood and legacy and the weight of a name. He thought about Felix, who had been shaped by standing in Conrad's shadow and had nearly been bent the wrong way by it. He thought about Reese, who had been shaped by having no one and had somehow come out of it with more integrity than most people he'd known his whole life. He thought about what kind of father he wanted to be. He thought about what kind of man he was now versus the man he had been 40 days ago, when the world was simpler and his certainties were intact and he controlled everything in his life with the clean, cold precision of a machine. That man was gone. He wasn't sure yet who was replacing him, but he thought, sitting alone in the quiet of his office while his empire reorganized itself around the truth and his enemies recalculated their moves and the woman upstairs carried the impossible into existence, he thought that the replacement might be better. His phone buzzed. A text from Damien. "DeCaro's people are quiet. Real estate story is moving. Think they're rattled." Conrad set the phone down. He went upstairs. He knocked on Reese's open door. She looked up from the desk. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Sit down," she said, and the echo of his own words from the day before almost made him smile. He sat. "The doctor called," Conrad said. "Harmon." He watched her face change just slightly. He made an error in the original diagnosis. The damage was less than he reported. Reese stared at him. Which means, Conrad said, that what we're dealing with upstairs medically, it's not the miracle I thought it was. It's still unexpected, still extraordinary. He paused. But it's not impossible. It never was. Reese was quiet for a moment, and then she said something he didn't expect. Does it change how you feel about it? He looked at her. No, he said honestly. Does it change how you feel? She thought about it with the genuine, unhurried consideration that he had come to understand was simply how she operated, never performing a response, always arriving at the real one. No, she said. It was already real to me. They sat in the quiet of that for a moment. Then Reese said, what are you going to do about DeCaro? And Conrad leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for the first time in weeks, the man who had walked into a doctor's office with a future and walked out without one looked like himself again, completely, dangerously, unmistakably himself. I'm going to let him keep talking, Conrad said, because every word he says now is going to look worse when the truth comes out. And when I'm ready, when the timing is exactly right, I'm going to make an announcement that ends this entire conversation. Reese held his gaze. When is the timing right? Conrad looked at Harris. When are you comfortable? He said. She blinked. The question surprised her. He could see it. You're asking me, she said. It's your announcement too. She sat with that. The woman who had made herself invisible for survival, who had learned that opinions were luxuries, people in her position couldn't afford, who had walked into a contract because it was the best option available. That woman sat with the fact that the most powerful man she had ever met was asking her when she was comfortable. 2 weeks, she said finally. Give me 2 weeks. I want to be past the first trimester marker. 2 weeks, Conrad agreed. And Conrad. She waited until he looked at her directly. When you make the announcement, don't do it as a strategy. Do it as a father. The word father hit him somewhere he hadn't armored. He nodded once slowly. As a father, he said, and meant it entirely. The 2 weeks Reese asked for were the longest and shortest of Conrad's life simultaneously. On the outside, the empire moved with controlled precision. The real estate story on Victor DeCaro spread through the right channels, the way fire spreads through dry grass, not in a single explosive moment, but steadily, inevitably, until the smoke was visible from every direction. 3 of DeCaro's business partners quietly distanced themselves. A federal contact of Peretti's confirmed that the investigation into the contractor had expanded. Victor DeCaro's second public statement, the one that had doubled down so confidently, now sat in the air like a bad smell that wouldn't clear. Conrad let it sit. He said nothing publicly. He made no counterstatement, no denial, no dramatic press conference. He simply continued to run his organization with the same unhurried, absolute authority he always had, and let Victor DeCaro's noise fill the silence until the noise started to sound exactly like what? It was a man who had moved too fast and couldn't stop moving, because stopping would mean admitting the ground had shifted under him. On the inside, though, inside the house, inside Conrad's chest, everything was different. He started having breakfast in the kitchen. Not at the formal dining table, not with his phone and his reports and the organized distance he had always maintained from anyone who lived in his space. In the kitchen at the small table near the window, because that was where Reese was every morning at 7 o'clock with her tea and her quiet and her particular way of existing in a room that made the room feel inhabited rather than occupied. He told himself it was practical. He needed to be available if she needed anything. The pregnancy changed the logistics of the household. He was lying to himself, and he knew it, and he did it anyway. The first morning he showed up in the kitchen with his coffee and sat across from her. She looked at him for a long moment and said nothing. She went back to her tea. He opened his phone and pretended to read reports. The second morning she had already made him coffee without being asked. He didn't comment on it. She didn't either. But something about the small, unannounced gesture sat with him all day in a way that no strategic victory had in months. By the end of the first week, they were talking over breakfast. Not about the organization, not about the announcement, not about the DeCaros or Felix or the medical team that now visited every Tuesday. They talked about smaller things, a book she was reading, a story he had heard from Marco about a neighborhood they both knew. The kind of conversation that doesn't accomplish anything and doesn't need to. Conrad hadn't had a conversation like that in years. He hadn't realized how much he missed them until he was sitting in the middle of one and didn't want it to end. On the ninth day, Damien came to the house. He sat across from Conrad in the office, and his expression was the one he wore when the news was the kind that needed to be delivered sitting down. Victor DeCaro reached out, Damien said. Conrad went still. To who? To Reese. The temperature in the room dropped. Explain, Conrad said, his voice perfectly flat. He didn't contact her directly. He went through an intermediary, a woman named Sylvia Marsh. She's a local socialite, runs charity events, has connections to half the city's wealthy families. She approached Reese yesterday afternoon at the pharmacy near the estate. Damien paused. Reese didn't tell you. The last sentence landed like a separate blow. Conrad stood up slowly. What did Sylvia Marsh say to her? We don't have the exact conversation. We have the surveillance footage of the meeting they spoke for about 6 minutes outside the pharmacy. Reese walked away. She didn't engage beyond what she had to. Damien hesitated. But the fact that DeCaro found her at a pharmacy, boss, that means someone inside the medical team talked. He knows she's pregnant. Conrad's jaw tightened. Which doctor? We're working on it. Work faster. Conrad moved toward the door. I need 20 minutes. Conrad. Damien used his given name, which he only did when he was genuinely worried. Be careful how you approach this. She didn't tell you, but that doesn't mean she's compromised. She might have had her reasons. Conrad stopped with his hand on the door. I know, he said. He went upstairs. Reese was in her room. The door was open. It was always open now. And she looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and he watched her read his face with that quick, accurate intelligence of hers and understand that he knew. She set down what she was holding. Sit down, she said. I'll stand. Conrad, sit down. He sat across from her, and he waited because she deserved the chance to speak first. A woman approached me yesterday, Reese said. Sylvia Marsh. She told me she was a friend of the family and wanted to pass along a message from Victor DeCaro. What was the message? Reese looked at him directly. He said that you've been using me, that the marriage is a manufactured cover for a medical condition that makes you unfit to lead. He said that when his information goes fully public, everyone will know the pregnancy is impossible, and I'll be left holding the consequences of a lie I never agreed to tell. She paused. He offered me money and a clean exit if I walked away and confirmed his narrative. Every muscle in Conrad's body was controlled and still. How much money? Enough to clear my debt 3 times over and start fresh somewhere new. He held her gaze. And I told her to tell Victor DeCaro that I make my own decisions, Reese said, and that he should mind his business. Silence. You didn't tell me, Conrad said. No. Why bother you? She looked at him with that honesty she never seemed to be able to turn off. Because I wanted to make sure I knew what my answer was before I told you what the question had been. I didn't want to react. I wanted to decide. He stared at her. And if your answer had been different, he said, quietly, not accusingly, genuinely, then I would have told you that too, she said, and we would have handled it. He sat with that for a moment. The specific, unfamiliar experience of being trusted to handle honesty rather than being protected from it. Someone on the medical team talked, he said. DeCaro knows about the pregnancy. Her expression shifted, not fear, but the alert recalibration of someone who understands immediately what that means. He's going to try to use it. Yes, he'll claim it's fabricated, artificial, a planted story to counter his narrative. Conrad paused. He'll try to discredit it before we can announce it. Reese was quiet for a moment. Then, so we move faster. You said 2 weeks. That was before he found the pharmacy, she said. Her hand moved to her midsection, that small, almost unconscious gesture he'd noticed her making more frequently. I'm not going to let him frame the story before we can tell it ourselves. When do you want to move? Conrad looked at her. Are you sure? I'm sure. He nodded once. I'll call Peretti tonight. We announce in 48 hours. Conrad. She stopped him as he stood. I want to be there. When you make the announcement. I don't want to be a name in a statement. I want to be standing next to you. He looked at her for a long moment, the woman who had walked into his life with 2 duffel bags and a clean, uncomplicated refusal to disappear, and felt something in his chest move in a way he no longer tried to name or categorize. You will be, he said. The announcement was made at a private dinner, with 30 of the most influential people in the city, business leaders, politicians, community figures, the kind of gathering that wasn't reported on directly, but whose conversations shaped what was reported on everywhere else. Conrad had used this format before. It was more powerful than a press conference because it felt like being trusted with a secret, and people who feel trusted become advocates. Reese wore a deep blue dress that she had chosen herself, which Conrad had only learned when Mrs. Aldrin mentioned it quietly. He had offered to have something sent. Reese had declined, which was exactly like her. They arrived together, they moved through the room together, and Conrad watched because Conrad always watched the way the room responded to her presence. Not the practiced, performing observation he usually conducted, but something more personal. He watched people encounter Reese Calloway and encounter the particular quality she had that he still couldn't fully articulate, the sense that she was exactly as present as she appeared, and not 1 ounce more or less. No performance. No angle. She shook hands. She remembered names. When one of the city's most powerful women, a real estate magnate named Gloria Trent, who had made 3 men cry in public and considered it Tuesday, engaged Reese in conversation about the challenges of entering a new world quickly, Reese answered with an honesty so direct and dry that Gloria Trent laughed out loud with genuine delight. Conrad, standing across the room, watched that exchange and thought, she doesn't need me to protect her in this room. She never did. The thought was both a relief and something else, something warmer. When the moment came, when the room had reached exactly the right temperature of comfort and trust, Conrad stood and spoke. He spoke about the organization briefly, about the city, about the work his family had done over 3 generations. He spoke about Reese not as a strategy, not as a piece of narrative architecture, but the way a man speaks about someone who matters, specifically with the particular details that can't be faked. He talked about watching her catch herself in a doorway without spilling a single drop. He talked about the contract she'd demanded with her own lawyer. He talked about her making her own tea. And then he said simply, without ceremony, "We're expecting twins. In approximately 6 months, the Valetti name will have a next generation. And I want the people in this room to be the first to know, because you are the people who will help shape the world those children grow into." The room was completely silent for 3 seconds. Then Gloria Trent started clapping, and the room followed, and the sound built into something that felt less like applause and more like confirmation, the collective exhale of a room of powerful people deciding that this was real, and this was the new reality, and they were choosing to be part of it. Reese stood beside him through all of it, straight-backed, clear-eyed, not performing joy, feeling it, which was different and invisible in the specific way that genuine things are always visible to people who know what they're looking for. Conrad reached over and took her hand. She looked at him briefly, surprised. He kept his eyes on the room. Her fingers closed around his. Victor Decaro's response came 9 hours later. It was not the devastating counter-narrative he had been building toward. It was a single statement attributed to his spokesman that characterized the announcement as a transparent attempt to distract from serious questions about leadership. It was thin. It was the statement of a man who had expected a different kind of announcement and had prepared the wrong response. Peretti called it a gift. Damien called it a death rattle. Conrad read it once and set it aside. What mattered more was the conversation that happened the following morning when Felix arrived at the house unannounced for the first time since Conrad could remember. He didn't call ahead. He knocked on the front door, which Marco answered, and Felix stood on the front step like a man who wasn't entirely sure of his welcome and had decided to show up anyway because waiting for certainty was too expensive. Conrad met him in the hallway. Felix looked at him. His older brother, who had always been larger in his life than anyone should be, who had cast a shadow Felix had spent 34 years navigating, and said, "I saw the announcement." "I know," Conrad said. "Twins," Felix said, and his voice cracked just slightly on the word. Conrad waited. "I almost," Felix stopped, pressed his mouth together, started again. "I answered Victor's calls. I listened to what he said. And there was a part of me, Conrad, I need to be honest with you, there was a part of me that wanted it to be true, that wanted you to be the one who finally couldn't hold everything together." He looked at his brother with the specific shame of someone confessing the thing they're most ashamed of. "Because I have been invisible in your life for 34 years, and I was tired of it. The hallway was very quiet. Conrad absorbed this not with coldness, not with the closed executive patience he used in meetings, but with something older and more human. The particular pain of understanding someone you love. I know, Conrad said. Felix looked at him. You know, I've known for a long time that I made you invisible. Conrad paused. That was not something I did deliberately, but it was something I did, and I'm sorry for it. The apology sat between them like something fragile and real. Felix exhaled. It was a long, slow exhale, the kind that releases something that has been held for a very long time. The port operations, Felix said finally. Yours, completely. Felix nodded slowly. Then he looked past Conrad toward the stairs, and something in his expression shifted into something softer. Can I see her, Reese? Conrad turned. Reese was at the top of the stairs, watching the two brothers with the careful assessing attention of a woman who has been listening and deciding. She's right there, Conrad said. Reese came down the stairs. She stopped in front of Felix and looked at him with those level, uncomplicated eyes. I heard everything, she said. Felix looked like he might apologize. She stopped him. I've spent most of my life being underestimated by people who thought their world was more important than mine, she said. I don't hold it against them. I hold them to what they do next. She paused. So what are you doing next, Felix? Felix stared at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, I'd like to be an uncle. Reese looked at him for one long beat. Okay, she said simply. And just like that, the war inside the family was over. That evening, after Felix left, after the house had settled into its quiet routine, Conrad found himself at Reese's doorway again, the place he kept returning to, the threshold he kept stopping at, as if crossing it required something he was still gathering. She was sitting at her desk. She looked up. You took his hand, she said, at the announcement. He realized she was talking about when he'd reached for her hand in the room. She had a way of circling back to things she was still processing, which he had learned to recognize. Yes, he said. That wasn't in the contract, she said. No, he agreed. She looked at him steadily. What was it then? He was quiet for a moment. The honest answer gathered itself slowly, the way honest answers always did for him, not quickly, not easily, but completely. It was true, he said. Reese looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression, not the controlled, measured thing she usually showed the world, but something underneath it. Something she hadn't decided to show yet, but hadn't managed to hide. Conrad, she said. Reese. I think she stopped. Started again. I think this stopped being an arrangement a while ago. He looked at her. For me too, he said. The silence between them was the most comfortable silence he'd experienced in years. Not empty, not tense, just real. I'm still terrified, she said. Of what? All of it. She gestured vaguely. The babies, this world, the fact that 3 months ago I was carrying water glasses for people who didn't know my name, and now she stopped, laughed once quietly in the particular way of someone laughing at the sheer improbability of their own life. Now I'm here. Are you happy? He asked. It came out more directly than he intended. But she received it the same way she received everything, without flinching. She thought about it, genuinely, the way she always did. I think, she said, I'm getting there. He nodded. Me too, he said. He didn't cross the threshold, but he stayed in the doorway longer than he had before, and neither of them moved to end the moment, and the life they had built out of strategy and necessity and a signed contract sat around them, transformed into something neither of them had planned for, and both of them separately and quietly had started to want. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A message from Damien. Victor DeCaro just called Peretti directly. Wants to talk. Conrad looked up at Reese. Something's happening, he said, with DeCaro. He wants to negotiate. Reese tilted her head. He doesn't negotiate unless he's losing. Exactly. She watched his face. What does that mean for us? Conrad looked at the message one more time. Then he looked at her, this woman who had rewritten his future without intending to, who was carrying 2 lives that weren't supposed to exist, who had turned a contract into something he didn't have a clean word for yet. It means, he said, that it's almost over. She looked at him carefully. The part with DeCaro. Yes, a pause. And the rest of it, she asked. He held her gaze. Victor DeCaro did not call Peretti to negotiate because he had found a conscience. He called because he had run out of road. Conrad understood this the moment Peretti relayed the terms of the opening conversation. DeCaro wanted a private meeting, no lawyers present on either side, neutral location, total discretion. A man who had gone public with his accusations 3 weeks ago was now asking for privacy. That was not the behavior of a man with leverage. That was the behavior of a man who had looked at what was coming and decided to try to slow it down before it arrived. Conrad told Peretti, "Tell him Thursday. My location not neutral, and he comes alone." Peretti hesitated. "Conrad, a neutral location is standard. He made his accusations publicly in my city," Conrad said. "He comes to my city to walk them back." Thursday came. Victor DeCaro arrived at Serafina at 7 in the evening, the restaurant where this whole thing had begun, which Conrad had chosen deliberately because context was its own kind of message. Victor was 61 years old, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades making others feel small. He walked in without his security as agreed and found Conrad already seated at the private corner table, the one that had always been held, always clean, always ready. Conrad did not stand when Victor entered. He gestured to the chair across from him. Victor sat. He looked at Conrad the way men who respect each other's danger look at each other, not with warmth, but with the specific attention of someone assessing how much has changed. "You look well," Victor said. "I am well," Conrad said. Victor glanced around the restaurant. No lawyers, no soldiers. "You wanted private." Conrad picked up his water glass. "This is private." Victor was quiet for a moment, the silence of a man arranging what he came to say. "My information was flawed," he said finally. "The source I relied on gave me an incomplete picture." "Your source was a clinic assistant who sold you partial information for partial money," Conrad said pleasantly, "and you moved on it without verifying because you were impatient." Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I made a public statement that was premature." "You made a public accusation that was wrong," Conrad corrected. "There's a difference. A premature statement is a timing error. An accusation built on stolen medical information is a choice." He set the glass down. "I want to hear you say that." Victor looked at him. "Conrad, say it, Victor. I need to hear it, said plainly before we discuss anything else." The older man held his gaze for a long moment, and then with the controlled, effortful dignity of a man who has not admitted error in a very long time, "I made an accusation that was wrong, based on bad information, and it was a mistake." Conrad nodded once. "Good. Now," Victor said, leaning forward slightly, "what do you want?" "A public retraction, complete, within 72 hours. Your spokesman reads a statement confirming that your previous claims were based on unverified information and that you withdraw them entirely." Conrad paused. "And you cut contact with anyone inside my organization. If I find out you've approached anyone in my circle again, anyone, when we stop having dinner conversations and start having different kinds of conversations." Victor was quiet, processing, calculating. This was the thing about men like Victor DeCaro. They were never not calculating, even when they were conceding. And in exchange, Conrad said, "I don't finish releasing what my team has compiled on your real estate dealings. I don't forward the contractor connection to my federal contacts. And I let you walk out of this restaurant with your organization intact." He paused. "I'm not offering you friendship, Victor. I'm offering you an exit that leaves you standing." Victor looked at him for a long time. "You've changed," Victor said, not with hostility, with something closer to genuine observation. "I have," Conrad agreed. "The woman," Victor said. "My wife," Conrad said. Simply, without defensiveness. Victor absorbed that. "And the children." "My children," Conrad said. Something moved across Victor DeCaro's face. Not defeat exactly. The thing that comes after defeat when a man looks at the situation clearly and begins the particular work of accepting it. "I'll have the retraction prepared tonight," Victor said. Conrad stood, extended his hand. Victor looked at it for a beat, then stood and shook it, the handshake of men who are not friends and never will be, but who have agreed clearly and completely on where the lines are drawn. Victor left. Conrad sat back down alone at the table. He picked up his phone and sent Damien a single message. "Done." Then he sat for a moment in the restaurant, where he had first watched Reese Calloway catch herself in a doorway without spilling a drop, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Longer than the infertility diagnosis, longer than the war with the DeCaros, maybe longer than he could clearly trace. He felt the specific quiet relief of a man whose hands are clean. He came home to find Reese in the kitchen. Not with tea this time. She was standing at the counter eating crackers with peanut butter and looking entirely unapologetic about it, which made him stop in the doorway and feel something in his chest go warm in a way that had become in the past few weeks completely ordinary and completely extraordinary at the same time. "How did it go?" she asked. "It's over," he said. She looked at him carefully, reading his face the way she always did. Over, retraction in 72 hours. Organization intact, no further contact. He crossed into the kitchen and leaned against the counter beside her. "It's done." Reese put down the cracker. She turned to face him and looked at him with those eyes that had never once pretended. And he watched something move through her expression. Relief, yes, but something bigger underneath it. The exhale of a woman who had walked into a war she hadn't chosen and had been holding her ground in it without complaint for weeks. "You okay?" she asked. "Yes," he paused. "Are you?" She almost smiled. "I'm eating crackers with peanut butter at 9 o'clock at night. I've been better." "The nausea, it comes and goes." She picked up the cracker again. "The doctor says it should ease up in the next few weeks." He watched her for a moment. "Do you need anything, Conrad?" She gave him a look that was gently exasperated and gently fond in equal measure, which was a look he had come to recognize as one of his favorites. "Stop asking me that every 4 hours. You're carrying 2 children." "I'm aware. You're hovering," she said, lovingly, but hovering. She tilted her head at him. "Sit down. Talk to me like a normal person." He sat at the kitchen table. She brought him coffee without being asked, the automatic, unthought gesture that had become as natural as breathing, and sat across from him. They sat in the kitchen at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night, with the empire quiet and the war ended, in the future growing in a reality neither of them had designed, and they talked. The way they had started doing in the mornings. Easy, without agenda. The conversation of 2 people who have stopped performing for each other. She told him about a letter she'd gotten from her cousin, the young one she sent money to every month, who had gotten into college on a partial scholarship and needed help with the rest. She said it the way she said things she wasn't sure she had a right to want help with directly, but braced. Conrad said, "Send me the tuition information tomorrow." She looked at him. "Conrad, it's not a negotiation," he said. Not the cold empire voice, just the plain, flat voice of a man who had made a decision. "You have family. Your family is my family. Send me the information." Reese looked at him for a long moment. The braced quality left her face and something softer replaced it. "You're going to be a terrifying father," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "Terrifying." "In the good way," she clarified. "The way that means nobody gets to be cruel to your children and survive it." He thought about that. "Yes," he agreed. "That's accurate." She smiled, a real one. The full version, unguarded, the one that he had seen only a handful of times and which always surprised him slightly, not because she was holding back ordinarily, but because this one was different in quality, reserved for moments she hadn't calculated. "What?" she asked, catching him watching. "Nothing," he said. She gave him that look again, the gently exasperated one. He decided to say the true thing because she had taught him without trying to that the true thing was almost always better than the managed thing. "I was thinking," he said, "that I'm glad it was you." She was quiet. "What do you mean?" "The contract, the arrangement." He held her gaze. "I had options. I could have approached this differently, and I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad it was you who sat across that table." Reese looked at him for a long moment. Her hand moved to her midsection, that small private gesture, and then back to the table. "I used to think," she said slowly, "that the best I could hope for was to get out from under the debt and start somewhere clean. A small apartment, enough money to breathe." She paused. "This is not what I planned." "No," he agreed. "Whatsoever," she said, and the word carried something enormous behind it. "I stopped planning for small things a few weeks ago." He understood what she meant. He understood it completely. The next morning, Felix came for breakfast. He called ahead this time, which Conrad noted. Growth. The three of them sat at the kitchen table, Felix eating with the uncomplicated appetite of a man who had been forgiven and was beginning to understand what to do with the forgiveness. Reese with her tea and her crackers, Conrad with his coffee, and the conversation was easy, in a way that family conversations had not been in the Valetti household for as long as Conrad could clearly remember. Felix asked Reese questions about the pregnancy with genuine interested curiosity rather than the probing, measuring attention he'd used at the first dinner. She answered him directly. They argued briefly and entertainingly about names. Felix had opinions. Reese had better opinions. Conrad said nothing and found himself thoroughly enjoying the argument. "You're not going to weigh in," Felix demanded. "You're both going to make your cases, and I'll decide when you're done," Conrad said. Felix stared at him. "That is the most Conrad Valetti sentence I have ever heard." Reese laughed, the full version, and Felix grinned at the sound of it, genuinely the grin of a man encountering something that makes the room better. And Conrad looked at his brother laughing with his wife at his kitchen table and felt the specific aching fullness of a life that had been rebuilt from rubble into something real. After breakfast, when Reese excused herself, Felix and Conrad sat alone with their coffee. "The port," Felix said. "I've been in the books for a week. It's a mess." "I know. Why didn't you clean it up before you handed it to me?" Conrad looked at him over the rim of his cup. "Because cleaning it up was the goom, and it's your deed now." Felix considered this, then nodded slowly with the private satisfaction of a man who has been handed something genuinely challenging and genuinely trusts that the person handing it to him believes he can handle it. "Conrad," Felix set down his cup. "What she said, that first dinner, about love earning its name over time." "Yes. She was talking about you two, but I think she was also just," Felix paused. "I think she was just right, in general." Conrad looked at his brother. "Yes," he said. "She usually is." Victor De Caro's retraction ran 68 hours later, 4 hours ahead of the deadline, which Conrad understood as its own kind of signal. A man meeting a deadline early is a man who wants to be done. The statement was complete, clean, and public. It ran in 3 major outlets. Within 24 hours, the story had shifted from Mafia Boss accused of being unfit to rival issues, full retraction amid questions about his own business dealings. Peretti called it textbook. Damien called it beautiful. Conrad read it once and filed it away. That night, he went to find Reese. She was at the window in her room, not the desk, the window standing with her hand flat on the glass and her profile lit by the city outside, and she was doing what she did when she thought she was alone. Nothing, just standing, just existing without managing it. He stopped in the doorway. She heard him and turned, unsurprised. She had a way of always knowing when he was nearby that he had stopped questioning. "It ran," she said. "Yes." She turned back to the window. "How does it feel?" He walked fully into the room for the first time, crossed to where she was standing, stood beside her and looked at what she was looking at, the city. His city, the one his father had told him blood was the only way to hold. "Lighter," he said. She nodded. She kept her eyes on the window, but her shoulder was close enough to his that he could feel the warmth of her without touching. "Conrad," she said, "what happens now?" "We build," he said, "an empire." "A family," he said. The empire was already there. She turned and looked at him, then fully close with the full weight of those honest eyes and said, "You know this is still terrifying to me. All of it. The size of this life. I know. You know I'm not someone who needs saving. I know that too. And you know that," she stopped, pressed her lips together once, the enormous thing carefully held. "I need you to be patient with me. With this, because I've never had anyone." She stopped again, shook her head slightly at herself at the incompleteness of the sentence. He reached out and took her hand, the way he had at the announcement, without calculation, without strategy, because it was simply the true and right thing to do. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. She looked at their hands, then at him. "That's a big promise," she said softly. "Yes," he agreed, "from a man who controls everything. From a man," he said quietly, "who has learned that the most important things are the ones you can't control. You can only choose them." She was quiet for a long time. The city hummed outside, the house settled around them, and slowly the enormous thing she had been holding in careful shape, The controlled composure, the protective distance, the armor that a hard life makes you believe is the same as strength. Slowly she let it down. Not all at once, not dramatically, just the way a person breathes out after holding it too long. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stood with her at the window of the room that used to be only hers in the house that was becoming theirs in the life that had been rebuilt from a medical report and a signed contract and a woman who caught herself in a doorway without spilling a drop. 4 months later, Damien stood outside the delivery room with Felix and Marco and 3 other men who had never in their professional lives been the kind of men who paced hospital hallways, and they paced. Felix wore a path in the floor. Marco prayed quietly in Italian. Damien kept checking his phone with the unfocused energy of a man who wanted to be useful and had no enemy to direct it at. When the nurse came out, she was smiling. "Mr. Valetti," she said. Felix stepped forward first, then corrected himself and stepped back. The door opened. Conrad stood in the doorway. He looked like himself, the eyes, the bearing, the controlled stillness, but with something layered over all of it that none of the men in the hallway had seen on him before. Not joy exactly, though it was that. Something older. Something that the word joy doesn't quite cover because it contains within it the full weight of what had been lost and what had been found and the miraculous, improbable distance between the two. "2 boys," he said. The hallway was completely silent for 1 full second. Then Felix made a sound that was not a word, something that came from somewhere deeper than language, and grabbed his brother and held him in the kind of embrace that men like the Valetti brothers don't perform and can't fake the embrace. That only happens when the thing you almost lost turns out to be the thing that was always meant to stay. Conrad held his brother back. When they separated, both of them were quiet in the way of men who have said everything they needed to without speaking. Damien cleared his throat. "Can we see them?" "Reese needs a few minutes," Conrad said. He paused. "Then yes." He turned back to the door, then stopped. Looked back at the men in the hallway, his soldiers, his lieutenants, the men who had built their lives around the Valetti name and the promise that it would endure. "Thank you," he said, "for standing." Marco pressed a hand to his chest. No words needed. Conrad went back inside. Reese was holding both boys when he came back to her side. She looked like she had been through something enormous because she had, and she looked completely devastatingly alive in a way that took his breath in a way he did not try to manage or contain. She looked up at him. "Come here," she said. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at the 2 faces, new impossibly small, completely real, and felt the stone that had lived in his chest since that day in Dr. Harmon's office dissolve so completely it was as if it had never been there at all. "They need names," Reese said quietly. "I know." He looked at her. "You first." She looked down at the boys, at one then the other, and said, "Dominic, for your father." A pause. "And James, for no one in particular, just because it's strong." Conrad was quiet for a moment. He thought about his father, who had believed blood was everything and had been right in ways he hadn't intended. He thought about the empire which would pass to these 2 boys who were not supposed to exist and had arrived anyway with the relentless, indifferent determination of life, asserting itself against all reasonable expectations. He thought about Reese, the waitress, the maid, the woman in the contract, his wife, who had walked into a strategy and turned it into something real by the simple, radical act of refusing to be anything less than exactly herself. "Dominic and James," he said. "Yes," she said. He reached out and put his arm around her carefully, and she leaned into him the way she had at the window 4 months ago, not dramatically, not as a performance, but with the simple trust of a woman who had decided finally that being held was not the same as being limited. "Conrad," she said. "Yes. We're going to be okay." It was not a question. It was the thing she had decided clearly, completely, in the voice of a woman who had survived everything life had handed her and had learned to tell the difference between a wish and a fact. He pressed his lips to her temple. "Yes," he said, "we are." The man who had been told he had no future sat in a hospital room with his wife and his 2 sons and understood finally and completely that his father had been right. Blood was everything. Not because of legacy, not because of empire, not because of what it built or preserved or protected, but because of this specific, breathing, impossible moment where the blood that moved through the veins of two small boys connected every broken and rebuilt piece of Conrad Valletti's life into something whole. He had walked into a doctor's office with a zero. He walked out of that hospital a father. And the woman who had made it possible, the one who had caught herself in a doorway without spilling a drop, who had demanded her own lawyer and made her own tea and told a mafia boss to be patient because she'd never had anyone. That woman was the realest thing Conrad Valletti had ever chosen. Not by contract, not by strategy, by the only thing that had ever actually mattered, the plain, stubborn, irreversible truth of it.